This is Matthew, host of the Superhero Ethics Podcast, and I've got an ethical question for you. If I'm trying to help you not listen to ads, is it ethical for me to do an ad to help you do that? If you go to our website, theethicalpanda.com, and just click on the join button, for $5 a month, $55 a year, you get to hear all of our episodes without ads. Was I ethical in doing this? Let me know. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're going back to Star Trek. We're talking about an episode from DS9, Deep Space Nine, called Far Beyond the Stars. But this is an episode that really touches on so much of the history of science fiction, the role of black authors and women authors and non-white male cis heterosexual authors in science fiction, the role of a show like Star Trek to do commentary on not only its own culture, but the genre it sits in and even the show itself. There's just so much that this episode gets into. And while I highly recommend, if you haven't seen the episode or haven't seen it in a while, hit pause, go watch it, then come back. Don't worry, even if you haven't talked about it, even if you haven't seen it, we're not going to be going too deep into the details of the episode. We'll give you a quick synopsis, but even if you haven't seen it, I think you're really going to enjoy a lot of the themes and stuff we talk about today. So, as usual, I'm joined by my co-host, Riki. Riki, how are we doing today?
Very good. This is at least in the top 3 for me for Deep Space Nine episodes. And to the listeners, if you're still here, this isn't necessarily an episode of television where the plot matters, per se. Listening to this discussion, I don't think will affect your future enjoyment of watching the episode if you have not seen it before.
Yeah. Let me give just a quick summary of the episode so people understand what's going on. The episode focuses on Captain Sisko. The episode focuses on Captain Benjamin Sisko, who is the captain. He's played by Avery Brooks, and the character is black, although that aspect of his character has just never been talked about really before this episode, in part because Star Trek is supposed to be this utopia where capitalism and racism and sexism and all the isms have pretty much gone away. In this episode, we're in the middle of a war against a group called the Dominion. There's a group called the Prophets that are kind of guiding Benjamin to be a leader, and he's having real doubts about the war. He's not sure if he should stay in the war. He's not sure. It's just wearing down on him, seeing all of his friends die, not knowing if there's an end. And he winds up kind of falling unconscious and having a vision. And this is something that has happened in Star Trek before, through some alien means or whatever. And there's a little bit of technobabble that explains this is probably being another vision from the prophets like he's had in the past. But in the vision, he becomes Benny, a science fiction author in New York City in the early 1950s, dealing with the fact that this magazine really enjoys his writing, really enjoys the writing of one of its authors, who's a woman. But the fact that those two, a black man and a white woman, are on the staff is not something that anyone can know about. There's a staff picture that's supposed to happen, but they don't want these two to have their pictures taken because they want people, as the editor says, Douglas, we just want this to be believable. And the character of Douglas is going to be really important in this because again and again he'll say, it's not that I have these racist feelings, it's just that people won't buy it, the readers. At one point as he says, I'm not a crusader, I'm not here to change the world, I'm just an editor of a science fiction magazine. That's become a very important concept. But Benny Russell goes home and he has this idea to write a story about a space station with a black captain. And basically, in the vision, he comes up with the idea of Deep Space Nine and he writes it. And he brings the story in, and all the other writers in the office love it, but the editor says, we can't do this. We can't publish a story about a black man as the captain of a space station. And Benny kind of resists and fights back some, but accepts it. Benny has a lot of other hard things go on that we'll talk about. And eventually they decide, what if this was a dream? What if we write it as though a black man is dreaming of a world in which a black captain could exist on a starship, a space station, far in the future? The editor very reluctantly decides to go along with it, but the publisher decides to pulp the whole issue. They just won't publish anything this month, and Benny is fired because the publisher just refuses to engage with this kind of content of a black man being a captain in outer space. And Benny then has this very important scene at the end of it where he kind of breaks down, but says again, I'm a human being. You can't deny these stories. They live in my imagination. You can't take my imagination from me. I fight this. And we end with back as Captain Benjamin Sisko on the space station, with him seemingly having more resolve to fight the fight that he has to fight. There's a lot else that goes into the episode, but I think that kind of covers the basis of it. And it was already a lot longer than I expected that to. There's so much with the episode I want to talk about. Riki, does that kind of cover the main points?
Yeah, very good.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about a couple of the ways in which there's a deep commentary happening in this episode, because obviously it's about racism in the science fiction world, but there's a lot of ways in which it's clearly commenting on racism at the time of the 1950s, but also racism in 1998 and sexism, and in some ways is even being somewhat critical of Trek itself. The actress who plays Kira on the show, most of the characters are played by actors from the show itself, just in the different roles in Benny's world. But Nana Visitor, who plays Kira, in this she plays Kay Eaton, a woman writer who publishes under the name Casey Hunter. And this is kind of a dig at Star Trek itself in a way, because one of the original and really powerful writers of Star Trek was a woman named Dorothy Fontana, who wrote under the pseudonym DC Fontana. So there's kind of a call out there, as well as the fact that I think it's really interesting and important that this is written by there are no people of color in the writer's room of Star Trek at the time this is being written. And so in some way, I don't know to what extent that's a meta commentary, or the authors trying to push their own publishers and their own producers to be like, hey, we got to get some people of color in here. But there's a lot of ways throughout the show in which they're kind of offering these critiques of science fiction writing in general, not only in the 1950s, but also in the 1990s, including Star Trek itself.
Yeah, I don't know that I would say that's a call out of Star Trek. I mean, it was the reality at the time is what it's pointing out. And we obviously can acknowledge that it's not a great reality, that women had to hide their gender in order to be accepted into this writing world. But, that's not to excuse what happened. But I think it's an acknowledgement as much as a criticism, I think.
Right. I think so. And there's, that was on, Dorothy was writing on the original show some years ago, but as I said, it's an all-white cast, all-white writer's room, even here in the 1990s. They do ask Avery Brooks to direct this episode. And normally you direct an episode that you have a very small part in, because the idea is that you can't really do both. But the writers in interviews about this episode said that it was really important to them that the black man be kind of in control of this episode, because they acknowledged, we wrote this, but there's a lot obviously that we're talking about that's not our experience.
Yeah, and I watched an interview with Ira Bear, who is the primary writer of this episode, and he talks about the fact that from the beginning, Avery Brooks was in the discussion. He went to Avery and said, this is an idea I have, do you want to do this first off? And then do you want to direct it? Was offered to him. So yes, I do think, acknowledging again that there were no black voices involved in the writing of this is fair. But I do think Avery doesn't have a writing credit, but he was heavily involved in crafting this to its final place.
Very much so. And he and a number of black commentators on this episode that we'll be quoting from at various points have praised the writers and said, look, obviously it's better to have a diverse writer's room, but they definitely did as good a job as they could have, and a very good job at that with this episode.
And I think that's the thing. We had this discussion, I guess, last week from the perspective of the listeners, right? Where is it okay for non-black people to talk about these issues? I absolutely do think it is. And I think it's okay for non-black people to write, television episodes, movies, etc. about these issues, but you have to involve people from that group, whether it's black or women or whatever. You can't just write it from your perspective, an outsider's perspective. You have to get more of an insider's perspective and then get the appropriate feedback on like, hey, does this feel like an authentic story?
Right. Yeah, because I think so often when you hear commentary like that, and that's true for black writers, for women writers, for queer writers, for any time a story is created within a particular context and is now being observed and commented on from people outside that context, then it's just important to understand like what's your place. And it's not that people only in that context can talk about it, but if you're outside of it, you need to know what you do or don't understand. Like a lot of the men who were very critical of Ms. Marvel or Captain Marvel, the movie was Captain Marvel. Yeah, right. Captain Marvel, I think, was a lot of men who were not necessarily listening to women talk about how this character that others saw as flat or not having a journey, like had this very powerful journey that men don't understand because they haven't experienced what it's talking about. And it's a controversial example. I get it. I'm not trying to open that up, but just I definitely feel like that's another good example of where anyone can talk about anything, and that's good, but knowing the context becomes super important. And
yeah,
it's like that's for the listeners, but also here, as you said, for the creation of this episode of Avery Brooks getting to have such an important role.
I think it's very important, like from a historical analysis of like the television program Deep Space Nine, to say, hey, like this was very important as Avery Brooks, Captain Sisko, being the first black lead of of Star Trek, of a Star Trek show, right? That is important and needs to be acknowledged. And that pushes the boundary further. And now we're having the discussion about, well, what about the writers? Like, were there writers? And it's like, no, maybe there weren't. You know, I don't know the full list, but it seems to be the case, right? Like, so I think this episode is progress.
Yeah.
And I think it's a perfectly fair criticism to say, hey, like, why was this written by a white guy?
Right.
I think it's because that's all there was available.
Right.
But they did it. I think they did it well. Is my synopsis.
No, I think it's very true. Yeah, because for an all-white group to just therefore not ever talk about racism is, I think, just far worse. In that kind of a regard. And I think there's sort of a meta thing happening in the episode as well, because one of the things that the episode is all about is imagination. And we're going to talk a lot about Afrofuturism, which is kind of this great movement of black science fiction writers and kind of a movement within black science fiction and black speculative fiction of imagination, of being able to imagine a world that doesn't necessarily have racism or where black people get to have much more empowered roles or whatever it is. And there's a way in which the entire show is written by white people, and so I'm not saying it is Afrofuturism, but it is a similarity in that the show isn't about how Captain Sisko has to overcome racism within Starfleet to become captain. The point is that it is a show of imagination, of saying we want to imagine that by the 23rd century, humanity has evolved enough that him being black is completely not important to whether or not he becomes captain. And I think this episode, and yes, it comes fairly late in the show, but I think it's somewhat important, is doing a really interesting thing of saying, okay, now we've done this imagination thing, and the whole show is about, let's show you a world where racism isn't a thing. Kind of like how we talked about how Schitt's Creek is showing a world where homophobia is just not a thing. But now this episode is saying, but there's a price to that imagination, and that us imagining that isn't an easy thing. And we did actually face a lot of racism when we said Avery Brooks is going to play our captain and things like that. And,
absolutely.
And so I love that this episode is about, let's actually talk about that process of imagination and the cost of that imagination.
I mean, this era in Star Trek, within a 2-year span, you had Avery Brooks helming Deep Space Nine, and then Kate Mulgrew being Captain Janeway on Voyager. Right? The first woman captain. At least to lead a show.
Right.
And the fandom and internet was very different at the time, but I do believe that there were a lot of loud voices who were decrying both of these selections.
Yeah. And in some ways the internet is not that different today. But yeah, I think it's a really important part of this conversation.
Well, I think the voices are always going to be there, but
Right.
they were less loud. It was harder to find them, I
Yeah.
imagine, or for
I think
them
it's
to
very
be
fair.
heard.
Avery Brooks didn't have an Instagram that he had to think about shutting down because of the people directly commenting to him and stuff like that. So let's talk about the episode itself. What for you is the power of this story of, particularly in that it's a story of failure? Benny has this great idea and he brings it forward and he is beaten down both metaphorically by the magazine editor and then publisher, but also literally he sees his good friend get shot by clearly very corrupt and racist cops, and then when he just sort of raises his voice, not even being violent at all, they start fighting him and he fights back and then he gets very violently beaten.
Yeah, this episode hits hard. Star Trek usually handles racism in a very kind of ham-fisted way with alien races,
Right.
right? Where the alien races that they encounter are like a monoculture. The Klingons are warriors, the Romulans are devious. And then that just kind of becomes their characteristic. And then the racism that's depicted on the show is usually like human versus one of these other races, or one of those races being
Right.
racist against another one in the galaxy. And yeah, it's hard to find examples of like human racism in terms of
Mm-hmm.
color of skin, because yeah, that's not really a thing in this
Right.
future. And that was by design from the very beginning, right? That
Yeah.
Gene Roddenberry wanted to have this multicultural crew for the
Right.
Enterprise. It was very important that, Uhura, a black woman, was on the bridge. Sulu, Japanese. Chekhov, I think
Right.
later on in season 1 or maybe in season 2, Chekhov, a Russian, right? At the time,
Mm-hmm.
1960s, tensions were very high, as
Yeah.
they are again, between the United States and Russia. And to have, this American cast with, American sounding
Yeah.
cast, I'll say, with a Russian on the
Mm-hmm.
bridge, right? Was this example of this is the future we could have,
Yeah.
where none
And,
of them care about these issues. They are
and
all part of the human collective. They're all part of the
mm-hmm.
Federation. They also have the Vulcan, Mr. Spock, right? So
Right.
like having that
And,
was very important to the DNA of Star Trek from the beginning, and was never. I don't think it was ever really acknowledged within the show. Right?
that's
It was
very
just
true.
accepted as a thing.
It was just very, again, it's that imagination of we're imagining a world where we don't have to talk about that. And
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up accents, because one thing in my research for this episode that I hadn't even realized is that when George Takei played Sulu, not only was it one of the first times we'd seen an Asian man in a place of command and sort of respect in that regard, but it was one of the first times we saw an Asian character who didn't have a thick, almost caricatured Asian accent. Because George Takei sounds like an American. Which he was. He, person of Japanese descent, but grew up in America, speaks like someone from that background, and the character of Mr. Sulu doesn't have the kind of Charlie Chan highly caricatured racist accent. So just one other cool thing about all that.
Yeah, yeah. George Takei was actually,
Takei, sorry, thank you.
was actually imprisoned, right, in
Yep.
the concentration camps
Yeah,
during
World
World
War
War
II.
II, because he was Japanese descent, and he's talked about that a lot and acknowledges that as like an important part of his personal history and why he is so active and involved in issues. And I do, yeah, like accents within Asian communities is interesting, because I don't know how I speak, but I think I have a little bit of an accent, not as much because I've grown up in the United States. My parents have much stronger accents. And I actually, since we're talking about this, I'll mention this, that I recently rewatched Godzilla -1 in the English dub, because I had heard it was quite good. and I found it very interesting because it was very good. And pretty much all of the voice cast for the dub was Asian American. The
Oh, that's
lead
really
was
cool.
played by a Japanese American actor that I'm quite familiar with, Darren Barnett, I believe is his name.
Uh-huh.
And they're all, I think most of them are, like very very American, but I could hear it. I could hear the accent, and
Right.
especially when they pronounced like Japanese names, like people's names or place names. It was very good and accurate. And I was like,
Yeah.
this is very nice to hear.
Yeah.
So yeah, like George Takei, has a pretty medium accent, I would say, and he just, I think he's speaking in his normal voice,
Right.
but there is something there, and it gives it that authenticity. You're right.
Yeah, for sure. And getting back to the episode itself, what were some of the dynamics that you really appreciated in terms of how they told this story of Benny trying to get this article published and the other writers supporting him, and then the editor kind of coming down on it, and how it all plays out?
Yeah, I loved, because pretty much most of the scenes take place in that room, like the common room in their office. I think some
Mm-hmm.
of them may have like little personal offices off to the side or their desks or whatever, but they're all sitting there talking about the issues or their stories. They're reading their stories and talking about giving feedback and stuff. And it was I know that some of these characters are supposedly modeled after real science fiction writers, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they're not named after them, but the people have commented on, like the Chief O'Brien's character, I think writes about robots. Like they mentioned
Yes.
that, and people have said, oh, we think that's probably like a reference to Asimov, who was very
Right.
famous for his robot stories. And
And is
and
also
so
famously for being what I think today we would see as autistic coded, which is very much who that character is as well.
yeah, and I think the key to this episode, I love it all. I love like
Mm-hmm.
all of their performances. You mentioned the thing about Nana Visitor being a woman and having to hide her identity, right? Like, but the key is the bad guy. One of the bad guys, at least, the editor,
Right.
right, played by the guy who usually plays Odo, Rene Auberjonois, and he's such a complicated character
Yeah.
in this episode. And it's one of those characters where you're like trying to root for him, and then he
Mm-hmm.
does something that is wrong, and you're like, come
Yeah.
on, man, just do the right thing. But you understand his position as well,
Right.
because it's his job on the line,
I,
and it's a very complicated dance of like his boss,
mm-hmm.
the owner, the
Right.
publisher has told him what to do, and it's like, do you go along with that? And do you pulp the magazine and fire Benny?
I think the fact that we meet him and we never see or meet Mr. Stone, the publisher, his
Yeah.
boss, is very intentional.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
I think Douglas, to me, he represents that, like, I don't have the exact quote, but the Dr. King quote about, if you uphold the status quo, those who say nothing in the face of injustice are, doing injustice themselves. I'm butchering the quote, but it's that idea of that you have to stand up against injustice and not just shrug your shoulders and say there's nothing we can do. And he very much represents that, but he's the middle manager. He's not, as you said, he's not the one making the decisions. He is, and like the other white writers, refusing to protest the decision, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but also the fact that we never get Benny never gets to talk to Mr. Stone.
Mm-hmm.
Douglas sees the pain that this causes, but Mr. Stone never does. And I think that's also a powerful point here about like the way society is structured, both in the 50s and also in the 1990s and also today. The manager of a local store tells us about the corporate policy that is kind of sexist or racist or classist or whatever it is, and we might yell at that person, and they're enforcing this policy, and like maybe more people shouldn't do that, not maybe, but they're not the ones who set the policy. And the people who set the policy, we have no access to. And so, yeah, I think there's so much to his character that is so interesting there.
Yeah. It very much reminded me, I was listening to a news story, and I apologize, I don't remember which publication it is, but I was listening to a news story about, no, I do. Sorry. It was 60 Minutes. It was an interview with Leslie Stahl, one of the co-anchors, and she was talking about how her boss, like the editor, I suppose, or producer, I guess, for television, stepped down in light of everything going on. And when he did, everyone else in the room was like, do you want us with you? Like, do you want solidarity? Do you want us to quit too? And he said, no, like, you have to stay here. Like, it's very important. Like, this is what I have to do for me personally, but you have to stay here and keep fighting. Right. And that's kind of the complicated situation with this, is that, is Douglas a bad guy? Like, I don't know. Yeah. Like he does some not great things in this, but you can also see that the caring, right, to some degree, that he has for the situation, for the people under him. And is he fighting a good enough fight against Mr. Stone, the invisible Mr. Stone? We don't know.
I had a very different reading of it. I see him very much as a villain here. And I think the episode is setting him up to be, but I definitely understand your perspective.
Well, it is setting him up to be, because he's the one we see delivering all the news.
Well, like, to me, I think one of the things that, and you're right, I think it sets him up that he is the face of a system. And so I'm more angry at the system than at him. But one thing is that they set up the magazine that they're writing for, that I think is called, like, Great Adventures or something, or Fantastic Tales. And they set it up against this other magazine called Galaxies. And at one point they mention, like, the name of some real life science fiction authors who are writing for them. Heinlein is the one I remember, but there's a couple of others. And all of them were writers who in actuality were using science fiction to push politics, to push social justice ideas. Heinlein had a lot of great ideas about sexuality and liberation in that regard. He also had some ideas that I think we'd look at as pretty fascist today, and I think I've often been on the show very critical of. But whatever, he was definitely using science fiction to push social conversation. And Galaxies is presented as different from this magazine, where Douglas specifically says, the quote is, "I'm not a crusader, I'm not out to change the world, I'm a science fiction editor." And to me, that was very telling. And it fits to me very much in a conversation that was alive in the 90s, but is also very much still alive today. To me, Douglas represents all those people who say, oh, I don't want politics in my Star Wars. Why does there have to be so much politics in Star Trek? I just want a good story. And that's exactly what Douglas is trying to say. And his comment that as an editor, his job is not to try to address social change and to address the problems of the world. Like, that's everything that's wrong with that part of science fiction writing. And I think I think you're right that I can have sympathy for Douglas the person, but I think he's very much the fact that he is willing to be a cog in this machine that is being called out is, I think, very problematic.
Sure, that's fair. But I mean, they're all a cog. They're all cogs in the machine. Mm-hmm. And again, like, when Benny is fired, no one else leaves in solidarity, right? They're going to stay. They're going to keep writing their stories. And that's a question you have to ask yourself, right? Like, if you're in that situation, we can judge them to some degree and say, like, what we would do, but ultimately, like, it's a very limited scope of a story. And I think it's more important to keep your seat at the table in situations like this. And that, to me, includes Douglas, right? Because he was willing to publish the story under the dream synopsis, right? He was like, if we change it to a dream, like, I think that works. And I believe, like, he was kind of excited about it, or at least, like, happy, right? He was like, yeah, I think that'll work. Like, let's go with that.
Oh, see, I got a very different impression. To me, it was, he was very much because he's also the one who calls out the character of Herb, who I don't know if he's based on a specific author, but it's very much kind of representative of Jewish liberal science fiction authors who were often sometimes rightly, but mostly unfairly, accused of being communists or fellow travelers or things like that. And Douglas is very quick to call them out, to say that, to say, oh, you're just being a pinko or a red or something like this. And to me, I think the critique of the show, I think you're right that if you're going to have a seat at the table, continuing to fight from that seat at the table is very valuable. And like we talked about in Andor, there's definitely a lot of that discussion of, Mon Mothma doesn't want Bail Organa to leave with her because she wants him to keep having that seat at the table in the Senate. But in this, it feels all of the characters sort of express sympathy, but none of them are willing to risk themselves and their jobs. Not, it seems like out of a strategy, but just out of their own personal caution. There's an essay I read by a person named Joshua M. Patton, he writes, I'm reference some of the other things he said. The article link will be in the show notes, and he's a black author himself. And he wrote, these writers understood the injustice being done, but nonetheless let Benny stand down, indirectly supporting the status quo. Thankfully, the Star Trek of today is more inclusive, from the folks beyond the scenes to the quality of stories given to historically represented demographics in a way. Far Beyond the Stars wasn't just an indictment of the real world, but also how Star Trek itself sometimes failed its own ideals. It's why nearly 3 decades later, it's still the most powerful episode of Deep Space Nine. And he then goes on to talk about how the character of Herb Rostov, as well as the woman writer, each of them kind of express sympathy for Benny's cause, but none of them are willing to do it themselves. All of them are more interested in protecting their own position than actually standing up and joining in the fight. And, I thought very significant that at one point, Nana's character says, there should be stronger women in science fiction, but she's not writing them herself. It's this sort of wishful thinking that all those other characters have of, it would be great if these things happened, but they're not happening.
Yeah. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's cyclically a problem everywhere.
Right.
Right. And I would take the long perspective on this, that from her perspective, like, there aren't enough women. She has to reach a point in her career where she has enough confidence and enough clout to write that story and have it be published, or like be the editor herself, like pay her dues long enough to be an editor and then approve that story, right? Like, that's kind of, unfortunately, like what has to happen, unless you have someone closer to the top in the power structure just decide to break it all and say F it, which is obviously not the case. And like in terms of Douglas, the current editor, right, like, we wish he could be that guy, but it's clear like his power dynamic is very weak. And if he were to make a stand in this scenario, and he would either be fired or he would say, I quit.
Right.
He's going to be replaced with some yes man, the next yes man, who will just also fire Benny. So like you probably are not accomplishing much other than like making this figurative stand. And then what do you do, right? So that's why I have more empathy for that character. That's fair. I say that, like, I acknowledge, like, he's not doing the right thing. Yeah. But he seems to be enough of a person who maybe, like, in the future. And that sucks. Like, I think, and then that's the point of this episode. Like, this episode sucks from the perspective of Benny Russell.
Yeah. And like, that's what it's trying to say. Fantastically high quality episode, but it's hard to watch because it's not about a victory in that kind of a way. Yeah. Although it is in a way, and I think that's what we're going to get to in a second. I guess, like, to me, the first time I watched this episode, I was a little disappointed that Benny doesn't focus his anger on Douglas. He talks about being angry at all of them. And I kind of had but Benny's the Douglas is the bad guy. Herb and all these other characters were standing up for you. And then I read some more about this episode and read kind of some of the critiques of those characters as that they're not looking for a seat at the table, as you're saying. They're just protecting themselves. And to me, I think his indictment of all of them, that he labels Douglas as that the others are being just as bad. Because I think what you're saying about the seat at the table, that works if they then turn around and say, fine, if you won't let a black man write a story about a black captain, I as a white man or I as a woman am going to write a story about a black captain. But they don't. And the other person of character who Avery Brooks himself describes as like the character being played by the actor who normally plays Bashir, and he says that this character is the brown man with an English accent who kind of holds himself aloof from Benny's struggle. He's the person you'd think of as the most natural ally. That all of them are just kind of like withdrawn, and they're sort of saying, okay, well, Benny went too far out on the limb. The lesson we're all going to learn is not that we should go out there with him, but that we have to pull ourselves back.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I think you're right. It's not an easy question. I don't think there's a line where I can say, like, this is what allies should do, or this is what allies shouldn't. This is when allies are fighting, and this is when allies are protecting themselves. But I think the show is raising that very, very question.
Yeah, I mean, that you bring up a very interesting point that I wasn't sure if we were going to talk about. But the character of Julian Bashir, or I guess the actor, right? Like, this is a very interesting situation. Again, like we're talking about late 90s, early 2000s. The actor, Alexander Siddig, is he is British, but he has Arabic ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
And he's, oh my gosh, yeah. Like I watched an interview with him where he says his full name, and I'm gonna try to read it right here. And apologies, this is my first time trying to read it, but Siddig El Tahir El Fadil El Siddig Abdurrahman Muhammad Ahmed Abdel Karim El Mahdi is his full birth name. And he goes by Alexander as an actor, right? And I think we can all understand that is for obvious reasons, and especially like in this time period, like 90s, 2000s, he did not make a big deal of his ancestry. There is no episode in Deep Space Nine where they talk about the issue of his race. Right. And yeah, I think like you could see this episode as a critique of that, like not of the person, but of the idea that, hey, like sometimes you just got to keep your head down, right? If you think you're next in line, and that goes back to the uncomfortable poem of like first they came for, and the question of like when do you make a stand, right? Yeah, and I think it's a really hard one, and and sometimes that's both the frustrating but the great part of Star Trek is often we don't get to know what happens next. I'd love to know, does Herb or Julius, who's the character being played by Alexander, or any of those characters, do they wind up writing a story like we were just talking about, or do they stay down? Because you'd hope that watching Benny lose it like this and be destroyed by the system, that they would start to write differently. But we just don't know. So it's another kind of great question the episode raises. One of the other important things I think about this episode is that we see Benny very consciously code switching a lot. And that we see Benny in two different worlds. He spends some of his time at the magazine where he is very kind of like shy. He's almost always looking down while talking to people until the scene at the end. He's somewhat reserved. And that's very different from when he's in Harlem, which they specifically kind of call out because they're close to the polo grounds. And I'll say more about that in a second. And there he spends a lot of time with his fiance, who is played by the woman who's playing his romantic partner in Deep Space Nine itself. The original character is Cassidy Yates. Played by Penny Johnson, I believe.
Penny Johnson.
And I don't remember the name of the in this universe character.
Penny Johnson, we've talked about her before. She's a fantastic actress. She's a big part of Orville. She was actually in ER early in her career, which I've been watching recently. And it's mostly set at this diner that she works at, that he spends a lot of time at, that we get a character named Willie Hawkins, played by Michael Dorff, who is 100% Willie Mays. Which is very, very, like they kind of wipe the serial numbers off. But, if you want to say some of those authors are representative of real life people, this is very much Willie Mays. And even I think he's a very important part of this role because he is at that point one of the epitomes of black success. This is shortly after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. He is a very well paid, living a high style of life, has girls who are into him, is very egotistical about it, very arrogant, but, in a kind of charming sort of way, although also off-putting somewhat. But he's living the high life, and even he says he has to live up in Harlem because the white people are happy to pay him to hit baseballs, but don't want him living among them.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael Dorn is just clearly having so much fun playing that character. What did you think of kind of the way of seeing Benny in this world?
Yeah, I think you're probably right about the Willie Mays comparison. I looked up Willie Mays' career. He was a rookie in 1951, and I think this is supposed to take place in like 52 or 53.
53, yep.
Yeah. And he played for the New York Giants.
Right.
And then was an MVP.
And they call that out specifically. Benny Russell asks him, if you're so good, why are the Giants in fourth place?
There you go. Well, I mean, he was the MVP in 1954, so wait a year.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, just always, Michael Dorn, always delightful in Star Trek. And good to see him without the makeup and be able to act without the makeup. I think he's a great actor in the makeup, but this episode really showed how great of an actor he is, and also expanded his range because he got to play a very un-Worf character,
Yeah.
and very charming.
Yeah.
Like those scenes, I love those scenes because it's a good contrast. And it's good to see those characters interacting in that way, in a more, I guess, more natural setting. Yeah. And then like a modern, like past from us, but from Deep Space Nine, like still modern, contemporary to us, like as a 20th century, 21st century Earth. And to see them be able to act in that setting together was nice. And a good use of all of them. So yeah, like I think it's important for the show to show Benny in like his home habitat. Right.
Well, I think it's especially because I think if you just watch him among the other writers at the office of his magazine, his sort of angry outburst feels so out of left field because I think they would say, oh, he's a shy guy. He never talks much. He's quiet and the like. And he's so different at home, not in a rude, angry way, but just, he dances with his girlfriend and he steps up to police. The second time, the first time he's very cowed by the police, I think for very understandable reasons. They assume he must be the janitor and wondering why he's so well dressed. How could he possibly be paid this way? And yeah, I just really love those scenes because to me it really shows like how much there's almost a science fictional aspect of him. He is traveling to a different world. He's going to a different world by leaving that community and going into the white world of writing. There's a writer about Afrofuturism who talked about how one idea of Afrofuturism is you can see the slave ships as spaceships because they're taking people to a land where they don't understand the culture, they don't understand the language, they don't understand any of the ways people treat, and they're all being treated as inferiors. Which you think about it, like how often is that how humans are treated in science fiction? They're taken prisoner by aliens and taken to these strange worlds and they don't know the language or the culture. So yeah, I think there's so much that's added to it by so much depth in all these different levels of how the show is written, how this episode is written.
Yeah. I do, and I love, like, the characters are not good; they're evil, right? But the two cops, the police officers, being played by two people who usually play the Dominion characters, who are the antagonists in the future part.
It's the
of the
actors who
show.
played Ducat and Waylon, the actors, the lead
Wei
Dominion
Yun.
and the lead Wei-Yun, thank you, the lead Dominion guy or representative, and then the lead Cardassian.
Yeah. And both of them are just amazing actors. Like that's part of the my love for Deep Space Nine is that these villains, these antagonists who are very secondary characters, like they're not in every episode, but when they appear, they just like bring it. Ducat is played by Mark Alimo,
Mm-hmm.
and I think he may be the best part of Deep Space Nine infrequently as he shows up. And then
Yeah.
Wei Yun, played by Jeffrey Combs, the reanimator,
Yep.
is a great fun villain to have. Like he's got this like smarminess. And then
I
Ducat, like I don't we've not never talked about Ducat, have we? Like
No,
as
we
an
haven't.
episode?
He's a villain that's be worth talking about.
Yeah. Because for me, like, I love Sinestro from Green Lantern. And he's
Mm-hmm.
that same villain who absolutely believes that he's the hero and he's
Right.
doing the right thing to just like psychotic degrees.
Right. And like there's a whole thing about religion that we haven't even gotten into, and he becomes eventually like just as convinced
Yeah.
as that Cisco is the representative of one group of aliens, that he's the representative of another group, these pod wraiths. I did comment in my notes that I thought Renee and Armin, the actors who play Odo and Quark respectively, must have been really thrilled by this episode because they didn't have to sit in a chair to do makeup for 2 hours. And that's probably true of the actors who play
Yeah,
Arlen.
like again,
and,
like all of them. It was
yeah.
a nice break. And they got to act as themselves. I mean, not as themselves, but without the makeup.
Right.
And I think that adds to this. Like everyone really seems to bring it.
Yeah.
No doubt, like they understood the importance of this episode, and so brought it in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm guessing like being freed from the makeup chair gave them like more stamina and energy to be able to act.
It's more hours in the day.
Yeah.
Benjamin Sisko was probably like, "What are you all doing here so early? I'm used to you coming in. I get to come in late because you all have to sit in the chair and I don't."
And you had mentioned earlier Benny Russell's like final scene in the writing room where he has an emotional breakdown. Right? That scene is so powerful. As you said, Benjamin Sisko was the primary director for the episode, but they have for scenes like where he has to act, they have a secondary director there. And I watched an interview talking about how the second director called cut on the scene, and Avery kind of like kept going,
Yeah.
kept weeping, like crying out, because like that was how much he was into this character in this moment.
And I think this is one of the areas where understanding context really matters, because that is a frequent critique brought against the show, particularly from white critics, though probably not exclusively, that he's overacting or that he goes too far. And in one of my favorite pieces about this by a man named Roger A. Sneed, writing in the Free Voice, black man, and he talks a lot about the concept of black pain, which he makes all one word, as this sort of like, generational trauma that's been passed down as generation after generation of black people, going all the way back to kidnapped slaves, through slavery and Jim Crow and all of it, experience the horrors of racism in different ways, but still there. And that we rarely get to see just the full depth of that. And he writes, while many of the reviews and analyses of this particular episode acknowledge the torturous history of race in this country, they do not adequately connect that pain, that black pain, to Brooks's reading of that scene. Simply put, critiques of Brooks's performance, particularly the breakdown, emanate from a white culture that cannot fathom black pain.
Yeah. I mean, I'm Japanese. I can't fathom it. And I would say, like, yes, when I watched this show growing up, I thought Avery Brooks did a lot of overacting, like the phrase we use, right? And more specifically, he draws very strong breaths
Right.
in between his sentences. is that good acting or bad acting? Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not an acting coach,
Yeah.
but even like his outburst in this episode, the force in his voice, like it is not that different from Captain Picard in when he's being
There are four lights.
tortured by Gul Madred.
Mm-hmm.
There are four lights like that. So I it's hard for me to, again, like I'm not an expert on acting and all that,
Right.
but like, are they so different? I don't know. I don't think so.
I think you're right. And I think, again, to me, this comes down to the central idea of all of this, which is imagination, which is that, I think part of the idea here is that in the same way that Douglas and Mr. Stone assume that readers cannot imagine a world in which a black man could be captain of a space station, that a lot of the people watching this show, I think, including myself to some extent, because I had some of those thoughts the first time I watched it, that we have a failure of imagination because we haven't experienced what this character is experiencing, and what the actor who's playing him has experienced of that black pain, that we have trouble imagining that this isn't overacting, that this is actually how a character like Benny Russell might react, and what the whole point of the episode is saying is to ask us to instead of looking at something and say, oh, I can't believe that, to say, why is it that someone who has a different experience than I am can imagine that, and what can I learn from that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point because when you think about the Captain Picard scene, he has been physically tortured by like a pain device. He's also been psychologically tortured and manipulated for days, maybe weeks. He's sitting naked on the floor, handcuffed. And so, yeah, like that scene when an audience member tries to imagine what it would be
Right.
like, it's like, oh yeah, like that would be painful. I would be shouting and screaming like this.
Right.
And then you transfer to the Benny Russell scene. It's like, like would he be like this? And yeah, like you have to really try to put yourself in his shoes of it's not physical pain, although he did have some physical pain from being beaten by the cops. But the psychological pain, the emotional damage of like he's been told like his story is not going to be published. He has been fired. He has been, as you said, abandoned by his friends, his coworkers. They've turned his back on him and will not stand in solidarity with him. He's alone.
Right.
And it's very different. It's a very different pain, but I think it is emoted appropriately to the situation.
And I think one of the things that this episode does so well is we often talk about how shows, they'll tell a story about racism by focusing on a white character who experiences it. And maybe the white character goes through a journey and becomes less racist or less sexist or homophobic, whatever it is. But we're still focusing on their reactions to things. And I thought was so interesting is that when Benny is calling those people out, calling out the people who sort of stand up for him, but don't. And I actually found a quote that I think is really relevant to this, where at one point Douglas says, after explaining why he thinks that readers won't buy this, and that therefore, is actually even just talking about, even before he's written the story, he's talking about why they can't have Benny's picture or the woman's character, her picture in the magazine. And Douglas says, I wish it was different, but it's not. And Benny responds, but wishing never changes anything. And so to me, that's again part of that critique of you sitting here feeling bad about it doesn't mean anything. You've got to do something. And then when Benny is very critical, and I can imagine that a lot of the writers would have that kind of reaction of that allies who've been called out might often have of, wait, no, I'm one of the good ones. Why are you mad at me? The camera never shows them. We have no idea how all those other writers react to what Benny is saying.
Nice.
Because the writers, the point of the episode is we don't care. We're not making it about Herb feeling hurt that, this person he thought was an ally to would calling him out. It's just focused on Benny himself and his reactions.
Yeah. And why cut away from that
Right.
performance?
Yeah, exactly.
I think a lot of comments online I read about this episode. A lot of people talked about being of, our generation, watching this as a kid or a young adult, like even like into the 20s. And it's like, okay, it's like an okay episode. And then rewatching it as a fully grown adult
Mm-hmm.
10, 20 years later and feeling the impact a lot more. And I think that's part of the effectiveness of this, of having this story in Deep Space Nine in science fiction, is that it's a good story. It's well
Mm-hmm.
acted, it's well written, and to some degree, I would say like it's like snuck in
Yeah.
to Deep Space Nine. But now
Yeah.
it's there.
Yeah.
It exists. And even if you missed it the first time, if you come back to it, like it can still impact you and change your perspective
Mm-hmm.
on things.
I mean, there's a lot of ways. I think in terms, we often talk about how older episodes have or haven't aged well.
Oh yeah.
I think this one has aged fantastically, and in part in a sad way because we're still having the same debates. Like every time people say like, "Oh, I don't want all this woke stuff in science fiction or fantasy or whatever," it's the exact same debate as what's happening in this episode.
Yeah. I just think people should watch this. Or if like you did watch it, rewatch it, and just like sit with it. Has your perspective changed
Yeah.
since you watched it last?
Now, there's a lot more I wanted to get into this episode. We've only briefly touched on Afrofuturism. There's a lot of really interesting things this episode is saying about religion and black religion that a lot of commentators had a lot to say about. This is the first and I think only time we hear the Bible referenced, and in a positive way. Although a character is like, I'm surprised to hear you quoting the Bible. But it ties into like the Benjamin Sisko as a religious figure. And also I think there's a lot we can say about, what this story has to say about the larger story of DS9 and his role as a war leader, and what is this episode really about in terms of inspiring him that, particularly because not a few episodes later, he makes some very ethically questionable choices that help win the war. And I think we're going to discuss that. And I also kept referencing how, like, in some ways, I think it is a victory, and that he doesn't allow his imagination to be dimmed, even as the world is crashing down on him. But we've gone about an hour. My blood sugar is plunging. And so I'm going to suggest, Riki, is if you're okay with it, let's end our episode right about here and plan to continue the discussion.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Okay. I mean, it's so deep. You're right. Like, I did so much reading about Afrofuturism, and you mentioned it, and I apologize. Yeah. Like, we didn't go down that rabbit hole. There were like so many other holes in this tunnel. But it's very important.
I was doing research, when I found this article on black theology that I hadn't even thought of. But yeah, like that, I mean, I think we mentioned last week when we talked about magical Negroes, is Benjamin Sisko a magical Negro? I don't think he is, but I think there's some argument to that. And the fact that as the first black man in a major role in leadership in Star Trek, he's also cast as this religious prophet figure is really interesting. So there's a lot we can talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I touched about the other black Star Trek characters, and there's definitely more I want to say about that, because I think it is always going to be an ongoing discussion. And I think that's the important part, is not to like just lock something that happens on a TV show in a vault, that it has to inform the next thing. Yeah.
I think so. All right. Well, listeners, thank you so much. As always, write in, let us your thoughts. We'll do feedback when we get to it. All right. Readers, as always, write in, let us know your thoughts. All the information is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. May the force be with you.
I have friends everywhere.